one of the pre-events of the Docomomo Conference 2024 in Santiago, Chile. We have today as a speaker Luis Noel. Luis is a professor at the National Autonomous University of Mexico. She's professor at the Research Aesthetics University, and she's also in charge of the conservation and maintenance of the campus of the university. As probably you know, she's very well known. She has a lot of books on Mexican and Latin American architecture, and she accepted the challenge of speak to us about the heritage, modern heritage in Mexico. Thank you, Luis, for being with us. And when you want, you can start.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And yes, it was a challenge because, and I'm sure the same thing happens with you in Chile, to have 50 minutes to explain what you normally explain to your students in a whole semester or 2 semesters. It's kind of complicated. So I made it quite succinct, and I'm just following one line, you will see, to try to bring about the idea of what is the most important part of Mexican architecture, mainly between 1925 and 1950 and the 1950s. Share. There. I have to start by saying that at the beginning of the 20th century, Mexico underwent a very complicated times of a revolution that was very hard, very harsh, very dreadful, very complicated. It lasted for about 10 years, between 1910 and 1921. And at the end of this revolution, many changes arrived. In a certain way, there's a parallel to what happened in Europe with World War, with what they call the Big War between 1914 and 18. And as a result of that, the way of thinking, the way of bringing about architecture changed. And that's mainly the path I will follow in this short presentation. We have to start with this man, José Villagrán García, an architect that started very young to be a teacher at the School of Architecture. Very soon, he was asked by his students, because he was in the atelier teaching design, by his students to teach theory. Why? Because the students said, we need this architect to tell us, to really explain us the theory behind of what he is showing and correcting in the design practice. So by 1926, at 25 years of age, José Villagrán García was teaching theory, and he kept teaching theory until he died. So most of the architects that studied for a long period, meaning between 26 and 80 in Mexico, had the theory class of José Villagrán García. And this is really important in one hand. On the other hand, In 1925, so it all happens around those 2 years, he was asked to do what is also known as the first modern building in Mexico, Granja Sanitaria, sanitary installation. What was this? Well, this was an installation to have the animals, the real animals, horses and cows, to make the vaccines. It was a very new idea, but Mexico, after undergoing this terrible war, needed to start producing vaccines against all the deadly diseases of the time, mainly tuberculosis and, well, forget the name, viruela. I forget the name of it in English. And it was a very different and a modern building, a building that had to do with how to keep the animals, had everything in sanitary condition, and make vaccines in Mexico for Mexican people. This is one of the stables, and you see part of it, it's coming from the teaching of mainly European architects, a clean architecture. But he never forgot he was in Mexico. So there are these overhanging roofs to protect the windows, to protect from the sun and from the rain. That is very different in the tropics than in Europe. This is the whole place for this installations. And this is the publication of his theory. They all go hand in hand. Like I said, 1925, he made the first modern building. So architects or young architects, young students were looking up to that. And of course, he was talking about this theory of architecture. What is this theory? Well, as he put it, he said, the difference found between architectural form, sculptural monumental form, and engineered building form, these three are what we know since Vitruvius, what's well-built, what is aesthetic, and what functions well. She says, show without effort the architectural value will be integrated, and he brings a fourth value. That's what's important from José Villagrán, and that will mark the architecture of all the first part of the 20th century in Mexico. He brings about a social value. That's his way of answering to a very strong nationalistic feeling Mexico had at the time, but he didn't answer with folkloric or historic architecture. He answered with an architecture that will serve to the majority. He wanted architecture to be useful, logical, aesthetical, that what had been repeated for a very long time in theories of architecture, but he brings about this fourth value, social. And his architecture and the architecture of most of his students will be showing this engagement with the service that architecture has to provide. He built interesting buildings like the first tuberculosis hospital in Mexico as early as 1929. Also the cardiology hospital. But what's most important is that associated with two other architects, Mario Pani and Enrique Yáñez, that we'll see a bit later on, he underwent with two big programs of building in Mexico around 1940, mainly between 43 42 and 46. The first one is a construction of hospitals, the first plan of construction of hospitals. What is this? Well, it was published in this number of Arquitectura Mexico. What is this? Well, he decided that to build a hospital is not just to design something, that you have to be in agreement with the doctors to build for the specialty, because medicine had already specialties at the time, and you have to build for that. It's not the same an oncology hospital that a hospital for children. So he put together the main doctors of Mexico, along with the Secretary of Health, and he put together with his disciples the already most important architects of Mexico. They did they first did studies, and then they did a plan of where to put and what kind of hospitals. For them, a hospital had to do with the attention, with the teaching, and with research, which is also something very forward at the time. He designed with Mario Pani, as we can see in here, a main medical center that was not built, but this is to show you how things were evolving. And this is one of the hospitals, the design of one of them, all along the country. The second big idea he had, again with Mario Pani and Enrique Yáñez, was this with the Minister of Education. It's the Administrator Committee for the Federal Program of Building of Schools. Schools needed, that were very important. The need of schools was huge, mainly in outside of the big cities. So they put up a program. Architects went to the different states. They made this analysis we see here of what they had, what was needed. They made the special design of chairs for the different types of age. They really did a very thorough study. And from here, it evolved a program that was all the 20th century on for building schools. First normal schools and then rural schools. And in this first part, all the design of the schemes and the studies was done by Hannes Meyer, the second director of the Bauhaus that lived in Mexico for 10 years and had also this very profound social idea of architecture. He himself built this school, but these are the designs for schools all over. This is in Campeche, a small town south of Mexico in the Yucatan Peninsula. But architects design small schools. This is a one classroom school, but they went along and designed the openings, how in a very hot climate, tropical climate, you don't have windows, you don't have glass, you have all these protections against the sun and to let the wind flow constantly. This is part of the studies that were done at the time. This is another one in Morelia. Of course, they look different according to the different places in Mexico and the different climates that they had. The first, he had a first group of important disciples. The first one is Juan Legarreta, that as you can see, died very young at 32 years of age. But he's very well known because he tackled a program that was very necessary at the time, and it's the housing problem of workers. After the revolution, many agricultural workers came to the big cities to work in industries that were starting at the time. If you think about the 20s and the 30s, is the time that industries were really starting especially in Latin America. And he devoted himself to the design of this type of houses. You can even say housing, because he did groups of 100 or 200 houses in different parts of the city. And that's why he is so well known. Even though he died very young, his input and his engagement in social housing was something we all recognize nowadays. This is the design with which he won the first prize with Justino Fernandez, a historian that at the time was was a draftsman. And this is very important. And this leads me to explain that the main three fields these architects work, as you saw, are health, education, and housing. And we will see throughout all of them different examples, different engagements, but always this sense of commitment, this sense of social engagement. It's not the second because he's more important or less important. I just put them in a certain order. Another of these first disciples of Villagrán is Juan O'Gorman. Juan O'Gorman that had a short period of architect, and then he became a painter. He opted to be more like a painter. And this is the image I sent because I think this shows the modernity they were all looking for. They were all looking for a modern architecture. That's why we call modern architecture or modern movement in Mexico this lecture. But as I say, with an engagement. This is a house, a small house, one of the first buildings he made, one for Mexico, it must be the first modern house, 1931, for his father. It's a data. This is where we know the date. He signed it in the first painting. Now it's been refurbished. I'll talk to this later, but we know exactly the date because he put it. This is an interesting house in a way, I think I have it here. Yes, evolving from the domino house from Le Corbusier, this idea of a house in pilotis with that allow windows all over and a night outside clear for him, for O'Gorman, an outside, beautiful outside stairs, dangerous, but beautiful. And this enormous windows for his father. This was supposed to be a house for his father that was a painter. So he needed a well-lighted studio. A house with very simple materials and almost no finishes. He knew, of course, he knew how to put everything inside, all the electricity and everything that had to do with water supply, but he decided to have it outside to show how it is a very simple, it is what he would call the architecture of poverty. And the ceilings are always apparent. The light, the electricity also. I particularly love this interior stairs, and he doesn't use normal balustrades. He used tubes, the tubes that you use to bring water. Well, that's what he used for all his handrails. Very soon, Diego Rivera, the painter, asked him, they became friends, asked him to do a studio for him. When he saw this studio, he said, this is what I need, and this is what I can pay, because it's not an expensive type of building. So this is the studio for Diego Rivera that he did, again with the same ideas of the pilotis, the stairs outside, the idea of the domino house, with a special double height studio, especially turned to the north, that is the best lighting for a painter studio, and with this industrial type of roofing to have a good lighting in the interior. In a certain way, the studio that Le Corbusier did for aux enfants is behind the idea of this studio. And the outside wall done with cactus, that is a way of doing, especially in the country, walls. Here is a photo of a recent photo, you might call, after the refurbishment, the putting up this to this house, and the next, the little blue house that was Frida Kahlo, who's Diego Rivera's wife at the time, to have them restored. And this is important to say, and like I said, also for the house of O'Gorman's father, because we are talking here in the midst of Docomomo, and the next Congress of Docomomo in Santiago. And I think it's very important to note when buildings on one hand are well refurbished, well restored, sometimes for the same use, sometimes as these ones as a very respectful museums, and also to understand the importance of keeping this type of buildings, and that they have a proper protection, and these buildings are protected by the National Institute of Fine Arts. This is a photo of the buildings almost finished by July 1932. That's how we can date these two interesting buildings, like they have the same features, everything. It's on the open. There's a very not very expensive type of buildings, and certain interesting things, like this is the kitchen and this is the way to throw out the trash. This is the interior of the studio of Diego Rivera. Here is O'Gorman in mezzanine that is in the back, looking at the studio. And this is the Le Corbusier for the Aux Enfants studio. He did many houses. Here I'm showing you a row of 3 houses for these 3 persons, Alfonso Sotomayor, Luis Enrique Erro, y Carlos Vallejo. This is important because these 3 persons, or these 3, they were engineers and astronomers like Luis Enrique Erro, are the founders of the National Polytechnic Institute of Mexico. And he was very close to them, and that's why he installed the School of Architecture and Engineering in the National Institute, the National Polytechnic Institute. He was the founder of that school, Juan O'Gorman, and he was a teacher there for quite some time. This is the house for the astronomer, Luis Enrique Erro, and it's not just a drawing. I found this very interesting drawing of a house with an observatory because he was an astronomer. And here is a house, and you can see this is the wall, and here is the beginning of the observatory. So these houses were really built. They're lost now, like many houses of those times, but it shows how he was doing this very simple architecture. He did something very important in the schooling idea. This is the primary schools he did between 1931 and 1932. He did about 20 schools with a very low budget, always with the same idea of bringing about an architecture with very low cost, but thinking always of ideas like in school, of a well-lit classroom, a well-ventilated classroom. Let's remember it's 1932. Tuberculosis is still very hard at the time, and hygiene is also very important. So as you enter the school, and this is the photo of the time, and this is a photo of how the school is today, the first thing you see is a place to wash your hands. Now that we went through COVID, I think it's very interesting to notice how all the schools have places to wash their hands as students enter the school. This is another one. This is Escuela Mechoro Campo in Coyoacán. All the schools were placed in the outskirts of the city. This is a very well refurbished school. Here is to wash your hands, or the hands of the children's, and here also. And this is one of the schools also protected by declared monument by the National Institute of Fine Arts of Mexico. But by 1936, Juan O'Gorman will stop doing architecture and will engage himself with painting, and mainly mural painting. He will come back. We will see that just very quickly at the end with the National Library with the Central Library of the National University, where he combines art and architecture. Enrique Yáñez, we have already been talking about him because he was always close to Villagrán in the main two programs, the program of the hospitals and the program of the schools. After doing several buildings like this, for electrician union, he devoted himself mainly to do hospitals, and hospitals that work very well and are still, after 70 years, in use, with very not many changes. And he did the National Medical Center, following the paths that had already, all the way, the diagonal way that was indicated by Villagrán and Mario Pani. Here are some of the buildings. This is one of the most important one, where we have this that are classrooms with the front a relief of stone by Jose Chavez Morado. And this will bring us to something that it's also relevant to Mexican architecture at the time. That is what we call integración plástica, plastic integration, that other Latin American countries, mainly Venezuela and Brazil, that also have important relation of arts and architecture. They call it synthesis of the arts, and it's part of the architecture in the 40s and the 50s, a very strong current at the time. Other hospitals by Enrique Yáñez. Another disciple of him, Enrique del Moral, that followed him in two ways. In one way, of course, in the social idea of architecture. In another way, because he wrote many theoretical articles, books, and he devoted himself also to be a teacher. And he was, for a time, the dean of the School of Architecture, just as José Villagrán García had been a few years before him. When he worked for the national school system in this 42 to 48, he did this school in Morelia, starting on a certain sense of regional architecture. When he also collaborated with the National Program of Hospitals, and he did this design for the hospital of San Luis Potosí in the north part of Mexico. And here is a photo of it at the time. His regional feelings came apparent in many studies that had to do with how to protect from the sun, how to use the wind in the best way. This is a house he did in Acapulco. And especially, this is his house in Mexico City, placed in the same street as Barragán House. So and done in the same idea, but 2 years before Barragán House. I'm not saying Barragán copied Del Moral. I'm not saying Del Moral was a teacher of Barragán. They both had the same idea of how a house should bring about big, thick walls and more related to what is a regional architecture, thinking of well-ventilated spaces, big windows to gardens, etc. One of his main buildings, and this is the one I choose a little bit to explain a little bit more about him and what we can call social architecture, is a huge, not a market, it's really the place where all the food would come to Mexico City and was distributed to more local markets. He was asked to do this big central of distribution, but he decided not to do a huge one building. He decided to do 7 buildings. And I'll explain why. He did one, this is the one we're looking at it, for fruits, vegetables, this type of things that are sold. He did a very well ventilated, you see this here as a trellis, well lit from above, and also ventilation, many doors, and all the doors protected. This is not really good modern movement, because modern movement will never put this. But in Mexico, there's sun, there's rain, and as you go out of the market and wait for whatever transport you're taking, you need to be protected. And all the stalls have water, sewage, looking at the hygiene of the place. The second building is the one for something that needs even more hygiene. That is the market of meat and everything relative to meat, cows, chicken, fish, etc. He put the installations to have refrigerators in all these places. And again, the same idea of ventilation, illumination. He did others like this one for what we call dry goods. He did a completely open one for flowers. Why not? Our climate allows it. And but he had two other buildings, important. One was a kindergarten, a place to keep the children. So the person that had the stalls had a place to keep the children while they were working here. And the second one, a large installation of baths. But it's not just a bathroom, it's a place to take a bath. These people, the people that worked in these places, and we know it, not always have a good bathroom, bath place to take baths in their houses, so they could come in here. This is a huge tower for the tank, and bath themselves, clean themselves, and clean their children. Again, the hygiene. And again, this idea of social architecture, not only doing what he was asked to do, that is a central place to sell things, dividing them so it be more hygienic, but serving the community that was working in these places. Also, he did hospitals. Again, he did a lot of architecture, but I'm going through very fast, so to keep on time. He did, and that's also an important thing to know, he did the master plan of the university, the university city of the National Autonomous University of Mexico, largest and most important university of Mexico, with Mario Pani. And at the time, they were both teachers. Then he became the Dean of Architecture. They were both teachers, and they were asked by their colleagues, architects, teachers, to get together and do this master plan. And after this, they became best friends, and they did many works together. I will only show you two. This is what was Minister of Water at the time, and many other buildings, and many buildings in Acapulco. This is the airport that I find was a fantastic place with the wind going through, etc. Well, so now we can get to Mario Pani. Mario Pani is in a way, a bit different case, because Mario Pani didn't study in Mexico, did not study with Jose Villagrán. The father of Mario Pani happened to be the consul of Mexico in Europe. And when Pani was about to start his university, he was a consul in Paris. So Mario Pani studied in the School of Beaux-Arts in Paris. But he came back to Mexico and understood the many complications this country had in relation to countries like the countries he had lived, that was mainly Italy and France. And he embraced this idea of building for the majority and caring for the majority. He was important because he published between 1938 and 1979 the magazine Arquitectura, later Arquitectura Mexico, where most of the Mexican architecture of the modern movement is recorded. For the schooling, the first school movement, he did the school for the teachers. He said, if we're going to build many schools, we need to build a main school to have the teachers for all the schools. With Orozco painting a mural. I'm going fast, but there's no way I can make it slower so you have an idea of what's happening in Mexico at the time. He also did the Music Conservatory of Mexico, because here, with this idea, not only because here musicians were learning, here they were teaching. One half of the conservatory was for the students that wanted to be musicians, either in an orchestra or composers, but the other half was to have teachers to teach music in the schools of Mexico. He also worked, like I said, in the national program of hospitals associated with Villagrán in the medical center. That didn't happen, but he did several hospitals, about 4 or 5 in different parts of Mexico. And he was also very interested in urbanism. Alongside, he had his office. He was teaching. He had an office of architecture and an office of urbanism with José Luis Cuevas and Domingo García Ramos. José Luis Cuevas is the first urbanist of Mexico, and Domingo García Ramos was a teacher of urbanism for a long time. This is for Mérida and Yucatán. As a result of all this, by 1949, he was in charge of the first unit of residential. There's another word of that for that. Sorry. Forgot the name. Unidad habitacional, the first. Okay, it's a residential area of house. It's a housing, low-cost housing. This is mainly for the workers of the federal government. And he was proposed at the beginning to do in this block, mainly to separate it in 4 blocks. He decided no, to have a big block in the ideas of Corbusier, or the teachings of Corbusier. And he also decided not 200 little houses in here, but to have 1,000 apartments in 6 tall buildings, 4 here, 5, 6, and 6 lower buildings, and living space for playgrounds, for a kindergarten, for a pool, and underneath all kind of stores and necessities for the apartments. The most interesting thing is this is the first tall, high-rise housing unit in Mexico. Then many others evolved, some from him, some from other people. Here you see it. The idea is to have a walkway, an outside walkway, to enter an apartment, 2 apartments, and to have the first part of the apartments in this floor, and the upper floor, the bedrooms of one apartment, the lower floor, the bedrooms for another apartment. This is the idea. As you enter, there are 2 small places for the apartments, and you go up and down to a larger part of bedrooms, all built on stilts, so the interior could be moved according to the necessities of the users. He did other housing units. This is the Benito Juarez unit with Carlos Mérida murals in concrete that are really the closets that you put out and have a larger bedroom. It's a very interesting unit. And then, of course, the master plan of the university city with Enrique del Moral. And we'll now look at it very quickly. But it's interesting because for many historians, and I think I agree, the university city, it's kind of the peak of this first movement of modernity in Mexico. The important and interesting thing is, again, this idea of service and this idea of community of architects. Mario Pani and Enrique del Moral didn't do the buildings. They did the master plan. They kept for themselves the tower of the dean of the university. But all the buildings were divided among over 50 architects in group of 3, sometimes 4 architects that designed each of the buildings. The buildings that had to do with academic, meaning schools and faculties, and the buildings that had to do with sports. And they invited many artists to work with them in this idea of the synthesis of the arts. Also, the National University is a very generous idea because the land that was acquired by the university from the government, of course, at the time, it's enormous. And nowadays, 33% part of that land is an ecological reserve not to be touched and to keep a very large green area by the National University. This is the master plan. This is the main part, the academic part, with the Dean Tower in here, and then here, philosophy, law, economics, science in this part. Now science is moved out to this area. Dentistry, medicine, veterinary, chemistry, engineering, and architecture. The public sports with the main stadium here that in 1968 became the Olympic Stadium, and a very generous sport area for the students and the academic body. And originally, it was supposed to be here housing for students. That never happened for various reasons. But the large area for sports remained. And of course, I have to show them because I think it's very important. Here you have Mario Pani, Enrique del Moral. This is Jose Luis Cuevas, that main and older than all of them, urbanist, Salvador Ortega, that worked with them too in the Dean's Tower. They were always group, so they invited a younger architect. This is Hilario Galguera. And this is the only woman that participated in the National University. She is not an architect. She was a good architect, but she is not an architect. She was in charge of all the art of all the projects. She was in charge of reviewing all the projects, being sure that the projects really got along, because you cannot have one corner of one encroaching into the other, to have a unity in the National University that is there, but respecting the personality and the creativity of each group of architects. She did a fantastic job. But she's mostly forgotten because she is not an author, she is not a designer of one of the buildings, but that's why I like to put that photo. And this is the photo of many of the architects that were part of that group. Pani del Moral, and many of them, here you have the names, they are the important architects of the time, some of them younger, some of them not so much, but these are the architects that did the architecture of Mexico, of modern movement in Mexico. But all of them, again, were students with Villagrán, and all of them with this sense of really serving the community and serving or with the idea that architecture is a profession of service. This is the Dean Tower, Mario Pani, Enrique del Moral. With them, the synthesis of the arts is with David Alfaro Siqueiros. Here in the room of the University Council, and there's another mural here and another on the other side. I'm not showing them. This is Juan O'Gorman that came back to architecture just to be an architect with Gustavo Saavedra and Juan Martínez de Velasco, and be able to do this fantastic over 4,000 square meters mural of natural stones that is the historic representation of culture. This is the European side. On the other side is the pre-Hispanic side. Here on this side is a university, and in this side is the modernity. I'm not stopping more in it. This is how the building was left to put in it the 1 meter by 1 meter mosaics done with stones. And I just needed to put this photo with Horacio Torrent in here because the first Docomomo journal we did in 1910, we had this image in the front of the magazine, and this relates with the 1910 conference in Mexico, and now in 1924, another conference in Latin America that I think we're all very proud of having by the end of the year. This is science, is not here anymore. Science moved outside, but this was the science tower and classes, the auditorium. A part of science is this pavilion for cosmic rays built by Jorge González Reina, with the cover calculated and built by Felix Candela, part of this new architecture that is coming about. This is a school of medicine with Ramirez Vázquez mainly, that is a well-known architect. This is chemistry. I'm just showing some of them. This is engineering with Francisco Serrano, that was a fantastic engineer. And this is architecture. Of course, one of the architects in here is José Villagrán García. For all these schools, the architects, like they did with the hospitals, they went with the specialist of each way of teaching. How do you teach chemistry? It's different the way you teach architecture, and it's different the way you teach law. So how those professors and those deans of those schools needed their schools, and the schools are designed in that way, and that's why up today the National University keeps very busy with many students and still working in the same buildings, practically with no changes, because they were built for what they were really needed. This is the stadium, University Stadium, that became Olympic in the Olympics of 68. And this is a large part of the the ball places. This is by Aray, that are very well known and bring about this nationalistic idea. And the road system by Domingo Garcia Ramos, inspired by Jose Luis Cuevas, and all the underpassages and protection, especially of pedestrians. Very quickly, at this moment, it's 1950, change will come. Other ways of looking at architecture will come. We'll have on one hand Barragan. Here I show him in El Generalife. And not that he doesn't care for people, but they didn't study with Villagrán, and the country is another country, and a country that is growing, especially economically, industrially, and for this, Barragan will do houses. I won't stop in here, but it's to talk about how to refurbish well or not. He did the gardens with Carlos Contreras, El Pedregal, this famous land development, several houses that are so famous that he got the Pritzker Prize in 1982. This is his house. And Clara Porceta, I also have to bring about. She's a fantastic interior designer, furniture that people think is by Barragan. No, it's by Clara Porceta. And then another very important architect of the time that shaped architecture of Mexico, that is Felix Candela, that we see here with his workers showing how the umbrellas of hyperbolic paraboloids really work and are strong. Felix Candela was born in Spain, studied in Madrid, and is part of the huge group of intellectuals that came to Mexico, intellectual architects and simply persons that came to Mexico exiled from the civil Spanish War. He did many warehouses and factories. Here are the photos of two. And he also worked with many architects, here with Joaquín Álvarez Ordóñez, doing these thin shells. And I have photos of how the workers are first working with the wood framework, then with very thin metal rods and things, and how they apply a very thick cement by hand, carrying it by hand, and how these things come about. That's why they're so thin and they're so wonderful. This brings us at the end of this first part of the modern architecture in Mexico, of this important movement that was mainly brought about by this idea of social service, or of service, and of being responsible with the environment and with whatever was needed. And this, and of course, being in Docomomo, in documentation and conservation, the conservation of some of these buildings, part of the university, I'm kind of proud. This is done by Victor Jimenez. And when Ana Tostoes, the former president of Docomomo, did a book with the most important examples of reuse, renovation, and restoration, it was in the front of the book. This is how we can say, yes, in Latin America, we have a fantastic modern architecture that evolved from our way of thinking, our way of doing, and how we are also keeping it modern as much as we can. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. Thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. Now we have a little time for questions and answers. Please. Any? Oh, Claudio, go ahead. Thank you. Thank you for starting.
Okay. Thanks for your conference, Luis. It was very interesting. I wanted to ask you something. We had a roundtable last week in Santiago about modern heritage. And about I wanted to ask that what happened with the health architectures in the idea of the heritage? Because it's obviously more convenient to preserve houses than hospitals. Hospitals are more complex, are in use. What's the Mexican experience about the conservation of the health architecture? Thank you.
Yes, you're right. Complicated because medicine has evolved a lot in 80 years, 1 century. Medicine has evolved a lot. 50 years ago, we never thought somebody could be operated with laser and have no scars or didn't exist. So that has forced the function of hospitals to change, and sometimes also the conservation of hospitals is complicated. But in Mexico, we have like 2 examples. Some, like La Raza, was, for me, horribly refurbished. Some others are really well kept, and the doctors in there are proud to have a building that is by a good architect. Sometimes what also happens is that the first part of the building that was built in 1948 or 1950 is kept, and then there's a second part in the back, like a tower or something, where they have, again, this new kind of techniques. And that can be, I think, the best way to try to keep hospitals, to protect hospitals. They're the most complicated ones. You were right to protect. Houses, even schools, are easier to do.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Luis. We have 7 questions on the chat. I will start with the first one is from Clara Lyon. She said, I would like to ask about the incorporation of arts in the building's facade. Were the intervention made by architects, by artists later, or by artists working with the architects at the same time?
Most of them are architects working with artists at the time. And some architects had their favorite artists to work with. And of course, this is something that happened, I can say, mainly in Mexico, Venezuela, and in Brazil, in this large scale. In Mexico, it happened because in this idea of social architecture, the big movement of muralism had also these ideas of social commitment. So it was easy to have the same ideas and to bring it about. But like I say, and I've written about it, and we've written in this Docomomo journal with Horacio, because this happened all over the world. It's not always a good result. What do I mean by that? Sometimes it's only like an addition, a they had, they wanted to do synthesis of the arts, but it didn't came about. It was not a real synthesis. It's the fault of the architect or the fault of the artist. I don't know, but it's not a good result or something that you really are interested about. A good synthesis of the art is, I try to explain like this. If you take out the art from the architecture is not the same, and art over there has nothing to do. When you cannot separate them, and when together is not an addition but a multiplication, the architecture or the building, it's better, more important because of it. Like I say, not all synthesis or not all work of artists and architects brings about a good result. That you never know. And that's part of creation. When an artist starts painting, he never knows if it's gonna be a real work of art or if it's just gonna be something. Also with architecture, when an architect designs a building, of course, he wants it to be important architecture. Sometimes it is, sometimes it fails. It's the same. There's no recipe, but the idea of synthesis of the arts is of them working together, not first having a building and then say, oh, we have an empty wall, let's do something in there. That is not synthesis of the arts.
Thank you, Luis. We have another one from Michelle Reyes. Michelle said that speaking about the social values of Villagran's architecture, do you think it has been sustainable over the time with the new challenges that arise? Which of Villagran's principles do you think can be improved to face current challenges?
I think the idea of social architecture is still there. And in countries like Mexico, many countries in Latin America, I think it's something that's still needed. We still need housing, we still need schools, we still need many of those. So I think his values are still there. The last part I didn't understand well, where she asked if there are buildings of him well kept or something like that.
If the building of hymns can be sustainable over time.
Yes, I think so. The School of Architecture has 70 years old with almost no addition and is working every day and the best architects of Mexico are coming out of there. For example, Mauricio Rocha is somebody that studied in the National University. So you might say it's still working. His schools, the Escuela Costa Rica, the one I show you from 1946, is still working, full of students. Some of the things like the Granja Sanitaria, no, because vaccines stopped being done with animals. So that, fortunately, instead of using it for something else, it was just turned down and done something else. But yes, I think his buildings, I didn't go through all his work. He did other hospitals that are still working, and he did the high schools. He did about 6 high schools for the National University, the high schools of the National University, and they are there, and they're working very well also.
Thank you, Luis. We have another here. I think we can merge the one from Rosario and the second from Florencia. I'm going to read both. Rosario Bernstein said, with the introduction of modern movement in Mexico, this was first seen as a way of making architecture for the majority, health, education, housing. But it presents diverse vernacular elements that are typical of the architecture of the place and are in response to climate conditions of Mexico. Regarding the synthesis of the arts in the works that follow with Mario Pani and other architects, what even triggered the murals and art to be part of this modern vernacular architecture? And the second one from Florencia, is there something in common that characterizes the buildings shown in Mexican architecture? How do they adapt to climate, culture, and other local factors?
Yes, in a way they relate. Well, first, let me tell you, Mexican architecture is much more than what I showed today. I choose to go through this idea because to me is what signifies Mexican architecture, this social engagement, what signifies a big part of Mexican architecture. But there were many architects, not that they were good or bad morally, that were working with private clients. And that's all right, as far as they were part of a service to a private client. And there were many houses and many office buildings and factories that I didn't present here, but we had very large architecture in Mexico. I focus into this because for me, this is the most important or the most signifying part of Mexican architecture. And it deals with the architect Jose Villagran that instaured a theory and was the first one to build modern architecture and teach modern architecture at the same time in the only school of architecture that was existing in Mexico. I will not call architecture that deals with climate vernacular. It's just architecture that understands what you're doing and where you are. You cannot do the same building in Chicago and in Yucatan, that is the tropic. You need to understand the sun, the wind, the humidity, the weather, the temperature. You need to understand that to build accordingly. And they're both modern, but they're modern in a different environment. So I will not call Mexico architectural vernacular, and the integration of the arts has nothing to do with vernacular. We have many people have studied that, or synthesis of the art. Brazil, there are many people studying that. And again, I would go back to the Docomomo Journal, 1910, that is online. All the Docomomo journals are online. And there are many articles that deal with this. And this just was a movement at the time. There were important artists that could participate with architects to have an architecture with a local, not vernacular, a local response. Because a building that has an intervention by tiles by Portinari or a mural by Diego Rivera are local to those places. That doesn't mean they're more, less modern, or vernacular at all.
Thank you, Luis. We have 3 or 4 questions more. From Jade Baptista, in relation to the uses of Jose Villagran's residential works. Are any of these structures currently inhabited as homes, or do they have another use? And said, considering the idea that most of the buildings that are part of the heritage of modern architecture are not inhabited. I think there's a wrong idea, but
Well, the house of Villagran did various houses, and some of them are still inhabited by maybe not the original owners because they probably died, but the children of the original owners. The houses, O'Gorman did also many houses. His own house, not the last house he did, but the house of the modern movement house is still inhabited by a lady that bought it, and she lives in there very happily. So, and with almost no changes, probably changed the bathroom to a much modern tub and basin, whatever. But, and changed the stove in the kitchen, probably. But I visited that house like 4 years ago, and it was the same house that O'Gorman lived in, because I had visited O'Gorman in that house. So some of the houses are still lived in. The problem sometimes with the houses is that the original owners die, and they have 4 children, 3 children, and the children decide it's better to sell and have each one their small part of money that one of them living in there and buying to the others. It's an economical thing that complicates this in houses. But many of them have been kept and people are living. Many people are living in the apartment buildings of Barragan and his houses. Many people still live in their houses that Barragan built, or their children live in the houses that Barragan built.
okay, thank you. From Macarena Vega, during the talk, you mentioned how important it was for these Mexican architects to have a social commitment. So my question is, how are the ideas of social commitment still important in saving modern buildings today? And what are the hardest parts of keeping these ideas alive, especially with a lot of changes happening in society? Additionally, have you seen this reflected in your experience with the conservation and maintenance of the university campus you oversee?
Two different things. On one hand, yes, there's still many architects convinced that their calling is social architecture. And they're architects that work either in communities or still mainly work for social housing, for schools. I think it's a personal calling, like I say, and this happened from the beginning. Not all architects that studied with Villagran decided to do housing, and people like Mario Pani that did not study with Villagran decided to do housing, and how housing was very important. So that, I think, it's a personal thing. It's a personal engagement. But like I said, in countries with many problems, with many social problems, Mexico, maybe Chile is better, maybe no, Chile is much better off, but we have problems, we have social problems, and we have to tend to to help those problems. And architecture, it's one of the main ways of helping schooling, housing, all that. Architecture has a very important part. What I do with the campus, that I don't call it social, I just call it, I have to be there. Of course, I have huge help from the Department of Architecture and Conservation of the National University. We're there with the upkeep of buildings, not easy, buildings that have 70 years of, most of them in main campus, 70 years old, with an intensive use of every day, lot of students going by, much of them not understanding it's a heritage site and they have to take care. And also materials, concrete get old, metal, the windows, because there are many windows, get old. You have to replace them, you have to be there. And then also another maybe problem it is, are the deans. All the deans want new things, want to change, want to leave some proof that they were there. They want to build something. And you always have to go and say, here, you cannot build anything else. This is it, World Heritage, and nothing else can be built in here. Not easy, but there are also persons you have to be dealing with.
I think I have a question here very related with what you are saying. Nicolas Diaz asked what comments can be made regarding the integration of the arts in the university city of UNAM, and why does it become important or relevant the place to place these murals in the project?
At the time, the architects and the artists wanted to be present in this. In 1949, 50, the university was also built in a very short time. In 3 years, it was built. It was a fantastic deed, thanks to an architect that was in charge of the building part, Carlos Lasso. And so that is one thing that has to be said. The other is everybody knew how important the National University was, how important this new campus was going to be, and they all wanted to be part of it. They wanted to be part either as architects or artists or as engineers, because there are also many engineers that work in there to do the calculations and the installations of some of the towers and and the buildings. So it was like a national feeling of doing something important. They knew it was something important at the time. And that's why also Mexico at the time had many important artists that were already working in public art. So it was not complicated for architects and artists to work together. They were already working together in other buildings. I don't know if that answers.
Yeah, thank you. I have a question related with this from Jose Elenes. I'm going back to the others later. I would like you to focus more on the following. Considering muralism as the only Latin American avant-garde, from that point of view, can we consider plastic integration as an evolution of the muralist movement or as an independent current?
Not clear the question. Muralism was born Mexican muralism. I'm not talking about murals by Giotto in Assisi, okay? I'm talking 20th century. 20th century in Mexico in the 20s, 1921 is the first one, La Creación by Diego Rivera in what at the time was the place of the dean of the university, the building of the dean of the university in Mexico. And it's a movement of artists that decided that art was not to be kept inside of private houses, that art should be for everybody, should bring about a message, and should be public. And all these artists, very good artists, very well known, Diego Rivera, David Alfaro Siqueiros, José Clemente Orozco, Chávez Morado, Carlos Mérida, many of them were decided to do this, and they're Montenegro, and they were doing murals already in different works, in schools. I'll show you a little one mural in one of the schools. I didn't talk about it, in the O'Gorman. Anyway, it was there. It was an idea of being present, and it became natural to work with architects. I don't know if that's the answer or what they asked me.
Okay, we have two related with Jose Villagran. One is Jose Villagran includes the fourth architecture value on social architecture. Could this be understood as a first approach to what we currently call participatory architecture, or did Mexican architects respond to this social character in a more distant way? And the other is, what are the main challenges and strategies involved in the conservation of modern architectural heritage in Mexico, particularly regarding the works of architects like Jose Villagran? Oh, no, it's not the same, sorry. How do this effort balance maintaining historical integrity with adapting to contemporary needs?
I forgot the first one.
The first one is Jose Villagran includes the fourth architecture.
Oh, okay, no, yeah, now I remember. It has nothing to do with
sorry.
Nothing to do with participatory architecture. Participatory architecture is when people talk to architects. Social value is working, having in mind that your work is to better the life of the majority. They had this in mind, yes, is an architect does know architecture, but doesn't know everything. So if you're going to do a hospital, an oncology hospital, you go with the main oncologists and ask them, what do you need in a building to have to install the oncology apparatus, and what kind of rooms you need for the patients, and etc. And then as an architect, solve that. But that is what architects learn. You have a client for a house, and the client tells you, I have 1 children, so I only need 2 bedrooms. Or I have only 1 children, but I need 3 bedrooms because I have family abroad and I need a bedroom for visitors. This is very pedestrian what I'm talking, but this is true. The architect answers to what the client needs. But it's important that Villagran started, and they did it again for the university. You go and talk to the client. The client is not some minister of I don't know what. The client is the doctor. The client is the teacher of dentistry. And what do you need in that hospital or what do you need in that school. That to me, it's a way of solving this social problem and has nothing to do with what we call now, I think, participatory architecture. The other one has to do with refurbishment of Villagran's buildings.
Well, what are the main challenges and strategies involved in the conservation of modern architectural heritage in Mexico, particularly regarding the work of architects like José Villagrán, and how do these efforts balance maintaining historical integrity and adapting to contemporary needs?
It's a big question, and it has to do with many, many ways of looking at it. There is in Mexico, the National Institute of Fine Arts, by law, is in charge of everything built starting in 1900. So modern movement is under the National Institute of Fine Arts, and they oversee the upkeep and the well-keeping of what they have either declared as national monuments or what is in their lists. They have a list that are buildings that have to be preserved in different ways. If it's a national monument, you cannot touch. Almost, it's something that has to be more kept. Or if it's in the list, there are things you can do and change, mainly interiorly. And in that list, there are the main buildings of all these important architects. But with those buildings, has to be the way of restoring and upkeeping it. It's, for me, a mere luck or chance that happens to buildings. Some buildings are lucky enough to have an owner that takes care of them and decides to have a good upkeeping, and some buildings are owned by somebody that just wants to throw them down and build there something that brings them more money, because a house brings a rent of 1 and a building of 10 floors will bring the rent of 10. So it's sometimes that is not easy. But you find owners. There's this person, Cesar something, I forgot his last name, that bought a house, the Prieto Lopez house, and got very close to a very good architect, and together they restored the house to the originality of the house. There's another house of Barragan that is still owned by the children of the first owners, and they kept the house. They keep the house because it's their parents' house and they want to keep it. And there are other people that just want to see how the house crumbles to do a 10-floor building. It's a chance. It's not easy, and but the National Institute of Fine Arts and many people, and I put myself in there, many people, like all the ones that we are in Docomomo, Mexico, we try to keep an eye, we try to take care, and we try to talk to people and have the people understand the importance of the buildings and of keeping of the buildings.
Thank you, Luis. That question were from Sofia Van Schevenstein and Jasmine Soto, both questions. And the last one is from Felipe Vasiliou, and Felipe asked on the relationship between modern Mexican architecture and the social factor. Was it the architects who took the initiative to contribute to the health and welfare of the people, or was it rather all governmental will? Thinking as an example, the public bus of the central market that you showed.
I think it's both. The public, they're not public bats. They're private bats for the people that work in that big central market. That I think it's Del Moral that had the idea, and also the kindergarten or place to keep the children of the workers. I think again that's Del Moral. They were always thinking, because they had this social idea of architecture, when they had a public building. Of course, if they had a house, or they built, because they did build office buildings, they did build office building to best suit the client. But in these cases, where they had to deal with something more public, they were always thinking the best way of doing what sometimes is called the extra mile, the extra thing to be of service. Not only to do what was asked, a very good market, but to do the best market in parts. One part needs refrigerators, the other one doesn't. Why to put them together? Have them separated is more hygienic. But also how all these people that were going to work there are going to have a better life, not only by working there, but by what I can build at the same time, almost with the same amount of money. And like for the National Plan of Hospitals, it was the Minister of Health that got together with Villagrán, with his important already architect at the time, and they talked together. This is the problem I have, said the minister. And the architect said, yes, we have to solve it. And they start talking, and they start inviting architects and doctors, and they came first with a seminar of architectural and medical studies. And in that seminar, there were doctors and architects, and then the national plan came about. It comes, of course, from the government, because they're the ones that charge it, and they are the ones that have the money to have things, but it also comes from the architect that said, okay, you have the money, let's do it this way, let's do it better.
Okay, thank you, Luis. It was a wonderful lecture and a wonderful conversation. Thank you again. We think we are going to an end of this pre-event. Thank you so much for being here with us, and I hope to see you in a few days. And of course, we are going to invite you as a key speaker, as you know.
I'm looking forward to that.
In the next days, we are resolving some other stuff, immediately stuff. We have immediately stuff every day, but we are going to send you an official letter. Thank you so much, and see you next time. And thank you for the public here. Thank you, Luis, and all the staff of Docomomo. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Natalia. Happy to hear of you. And thank you for the lecture. I hope to see you in Chile, said Natalia Cantergiani from Brazil. Also, I think Jose is from Mexico, Jose? I don't know. And it was here also Geepa Gupta from I think she's from India. Okay, thank you, said Jasmine. And Trilce said, follow us in @Docomomo Conference 2024. So see you in a
See
few
you
days.
in Chile in December.
Okay.
And congratulations for a very good work of expanding a conference through all this
In
time.
this way.
I
Well, we
think it's
have
fantastic.
next week we have a presentation from Turkey. Also, Niloufer is going to give us a lecture on Turkish modern heritage. Thank you so much. I asking for the students to stay here. We are going to have the same Zoom meeting. So bye bye.
Bye.
So much. See you.